In the middle decades of the 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire remained a patchwork of principalities, ecclesiastical territories, and free cities, each maintaining its own court, its own administration, and its own relationship to the broader structures of European power. The empire itself existed more as a concept than as a unified political entity, a loose confederation bound by tradition, by the authority of the Habsburg dynasty in Vienna, and by the intricate web of obligations and privileges that had accumulated over centuries of negotiation, warfare, and marriage alliance. Within this fragmented landscape, music occupied a specific and clearly defined position in the social order, serving primarily as an ornament to religious ceremony, aristocratic entertainment, and civic celebration. The practice of music was regulated by guild structures, by church authorities, and by the preferences of those who maintained the resources necessary to employ musicians on a regular basis. The Catholic Church, having emerged from the theological and political upheavals of the previous 2 centuries, continued to function as one of the primary patrons of musical activity throughout the German-speaking territories. Prince-archbishops governed substantial territories from their seats in cities such as Salzburg, maintaining courts that combined ecclesiastical authority with secular political power. These prelates employed musicians as they employed any other class of skilled craftsmen, expecting regular service in exchange for salary, housing, and the various privileges associated with court employment. The musical establishments maintained by these ecclesiastical courts varied in size and ambition, but generally included a core group of instrumentalists, singers, and a Kapellmeister responsible for the overall administration of musical affairs. The church calendar dictated much of this musical activity, with feast days, saints' days, and the liturgical seasons, requiring specific types of ceremonial music performed according to established conventions. Secular courts throughout the empire maintained similar musical establishments, though the emphasis and resources devoted to music varied considerably depending on the interests and financial circumstances of the ruling prince. Some courts maintained opera houses and employed Italian composers to provide entertainment in the latest fashionable style from Venice, Naples, or Rome. Others focused their musical resources on church music, on chamber music for private entertainment, or on military bands. The court of Vienna, seat of the Habsburg emperors, set standards that other courts throughout the empire attempted to emulate according to their means. Italian opera dominated the Viennese stage, and Italian musicians held many of the most prestigious positions in the imperial musical establishment. German and Austrian musicians trained in this environment learned to work within conventions, largely established elsewhere, adapting Italian models to local circumstances and to the particular demands of their employers. The training of musicians followed established patterns during this period. Boys showing musical aptitude might receive instruction as choir boys in cathedral schools, where they learned the fundamentals of singing, sight reading, and the theoretical principles underlying the practice of composition. Others learned through apprenticeship to established musicians, gradually acquiring skills through observation, imitation, and practice. The guild system regulated the activities of town musicians, determining who could perform at weddings, civic ceremonies, and other public occasions. Court musicians operated outside this guild structure, but their positions depended entirely on maintaining the favor of their employers. Musicians expected to fulfill whatever duties their positions required, whether composing new works, performing on multiple instruments, teaching the children of court officials, or copying parts for other musicians to perform. Musical style during this period adhered to conventions that had developed over the course of the previous century. The Baroque style, with its emphasis on elaborate ornamentation, figured bass accompaniment, and the doctrine of the affections, was gradually giving way to newer approaches that emphasized clearer melodic lines, simpler harmonies, and more regular phrase structures. This transition occurred gradually and unevenly across different regions and different musical genres. Church music tended to maintain older stylistic features longer than operatic music, and provincial courts continued practices that more fashionable centers had already abandoned. Composers learned their craft by studying the works of recognized masters, by copying and arranging the music of others, and by producing new works that demonstrated competence within established conventions. Innovation occurred within these frameworks rather than in opposition to them. The city of Salzburg, situated on the trade routes connecting northern Europe to Italy, maintained a modest court under the authority of its prince-archbishop. The city had a cathedral, a university, and the various religious institutions typical of a Catholic ecclesiastical center. The archbishop maintained a court chapel, employed musicians for church services, and occasionally sponsored theatrical productions. Salzburg existed in the shadow of Vienna and of the larger German courts, but its position on the Italian border gave it certain advantages of access to musicians and musical styles from the south. Musicians employed in Salzburg might expect a stable position with regular duties and regular pay, but without the opportunities for advancement or the exposure to the latest developments that positions in Vienna or other major capitals might provide. Into this ordered musical world, with its established hierarchies, its well-defined expectations, and its gradual patterns of stylistic evolution, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born on January 27, 1756. The Mozart household occupied quarters on the Getreidegasse, a street in the commercial district of Salzburg. Leopold Mozart, Wolfgang's father, held the position of deputy Kapellmeister in the court chapel of Prince Archbishop Sigismund von Schrattenbach. Leopold had arrived in Salzburg from Augsburg decades earlier, establishing himself as a competent violinist, composer, and teacher. He had published a treatise on violin playing that had gained some recognition beyond Salzburg, and he performed the various duties expected of a court musician with evident competence and reliability. His marriage to Anna Maria Pertl had produced 7 children, of whom only 2 survived past infancy. Maria Anna, called Nannerl, born in 1751, and Wolfgang, born 5 years later. The household maintained the standards of a respectable middle-class family employed in court. Service. Leopold received a regular salary, supplemented by income from private teaching and from the sale of his compositions. The family attended Mass regularly, observed the feast days and fasts of the Catholic calendar, and participated in the social life appropriate to their station. Leopold maintained connections with other musicians in Salzburg and corresponded with musical colleagues in other cities. He possessed a library that included musical treatises, scores, and works of literature appropriate to an educated household. The household economy depended on Leopold's continued employment and on maintaining the good opinion of his ecclesiastical employer. Wolfgang's early childhood proceeded within this environment. He exhibited an interest in music at a young age, listening to his father's teaching of Nannerl at the clavier and attempting to imitate what he heard. Leopold, observing this interest, began to provide systematic instruction to both children, teaching them keyboard technique, basic harmony, and the rudiments of musical notation. The instruction followed established pedagogical methods, proceeding from simple exercises to more complex pieces, from technical drill to interpretive performance. Nannerl progressed through this instruction with evident talent, learning pieces appropriate to her age and demonstrating competence at public performances organized by her father. Wolfgang's progress exceeded what Leopold had encountered in his previous experience as a teacher. The child demonstrated an unusually quick grasp of keyboard technique, an accurate memory for musical patterns, and an apparent ability to reproduce what he heard with minimal instruction. Leopold noted these developments with interest, adjusting his teaching methods to accommodate Wolfgang's rapid acquisition of new skills. By the time Wolfgang reached the age of 5, he could perform pieces at the keyboard that would normally require several more years of study. He began to experiment with creating small compositions, notating simple minuets and other dance forms with his father's assistance. Leopold recognized that Wolfgang's abilities represented something beyond ordinary musical talent. The question became how to develop these abilities in a way that would benefit the child's future prospects and the family's economic situation. Salzburg offered limited opportunities for a young musician, regardless of talent. The court chapel employed a fixed number of musicians, and positions became available only through death, retirement, or dismissal. Vienna and other major courts offered more possibilities, but required connections, patronage, and recognition that a deputy Kapellmeister in Salzburg could not easily provide. Leopold began to consider the possibility of presenting both children as performing prodigies, a practice that had some precedent in musical circles and that might attract the attention of potential patrons. In 1762, when Wolfgang was 6 years old, Leopold obtained permission from the Archbishop to travel with his family to Munich, where they performed before the Elector of Bavaria. The reception was favorable enough to encourage Leopold to plan a more ambitious journey. Later that year, the family traveled to Vienna, presenting the children in various aristocratic homes and gaining an audience with Empress Maria Theresa at Schönbrunn Palace. Wolfgang performed at the keyboard, played the violin, and demonstrated his ability to identify tones and to improvise on given themes. The Empress and her court received the child with interest and amusement, though no formal position or substantial patronage resulted from the visit. These early travels established a pattern that would dominate Wolfgang's childhood and adolescence. Leopold organized increasingly extensive tours, traveling to Paris, London, the Netherlands, and various German cities, presenting the children as performing wonders and seeking aristocratic patronage, court positions, or other forms of recognition that might secure the family's future. The journeys required substantial advance preparation, including obtaining leave from Leopold's position in Salzburg, arranging letters of introduction to potential hosts, and planning routes that would maximize exposure while minimizing expense. Travel in the 18th century involved uncomfortable coaches, uncertain roads, and frequent illness. The family spent weeks or months in various cities, living in rented rooms, performing at courts, and in private homes, and managing the complex social negotiations required to maintain aristocratic interest without appearing mercenary. Wolfgang spent his childhood in this itinerant existence, performing almost daily, studying with his father during intervals between performances, and absorbing the musical practices of the various cities and courts where the family stayed. In London he encountered Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of the Leipzig cantor, who had established himself as a composer of Italian operas and had secured a position as music master to the Queen. The elder Bach treated the child with kindness, allowing him to sit on his lap at the keyboard while they played together, and Wolfgang absorbed aspects of Bach's compositional style. In Paris, the family met Baron Grimm and other figures associated with the philosophical and literary circles of the French Enlightenment. Wolfgang performed for aristocrats, published his first compositions, and continued the studies that Leopold directed with increasing specificity. The tours strained the family's resources and interrupted Leopold's career in Salzburg. The Archbishop granted extended leaves of absence, but with evident reluctance and with expectations that the journeys would yield tangible benefits. Leopold invested considerable sums in travel expenses, in appropriate clothing for court appearances, and in the various costs associated with maintaining the family away from home. The tours generated some income through payments for performances, through the sale of published compositions, and through occasional gifts from appreciative aristocrats, but the financial returns did not match Leopold's expenditures or his hopes for securing a lucrative position for Wolfgang at one of the major courts. Wolfgang returned to Salzburg periodically during these years, spending months at a time in the family quarters on the Getreidegasse. He continued his studies with his father, worked on compositions, and performed the duties expected of a young musician in a provincial court town. His education included instruction in languages, mathematics, and the various subjects considered appropriate for an educated person, though his formal schooling remained irregular and subordinate to his musical development. The regular structures of childhood, stable friendships, consistent routine, prolonged residence in a single place, remained largely unavailable. Wolfgang adapted to this pattern, learning to perform on demand, to please aristocratic audiences, and to manage the social requirements of a performing prodigy. By his early teenage years, Wolfgang had accumulated extensive experience performing, composing, and navigating the social expectations of aristocratic patronage. The novelty of a child prodigy, however, diminished as Wolfgang approached adolescence. Aristocratic audiences that had found a 6-year-old's abilities remarkable viewed a 13-year-old's similar performances with less wonder. Leopold recognized this transition and began to shift the focus of Wolfgang's career from performance toward composition, and from the novelty of a prodigy toward the establishment of a professional reputation as a composer capable of producing works for church, court, and theater. The family undertook another journey to Italy in 1769, traveling through the peninsula over the course of 15 months. Italy represented the center of operatic culture, the source of most compositional conventions, and the location where European musicians sought recognition and validation. Leopold planned the journey carefully, obtaining letters of introduction to significant figures in Milan, Bologna, Florence, Rome, and Naples. Wolfgang performed in these cities, attended operas and concerts, met established composers and performers, and absorbed Italian musical practices with the focused attention that Leopold encouraged. In Bologna, Wolfgang studied counterpoint with Padre Giovanni Battista Martini, a renowned theorist and teacher who examined the young composer's technique and provided instruction in the complex polyphonic writing expected in church music. Wolfgang received a commission in Milan to compose an opera for the 1770-71 season. He worked on Mithridate, Re di Ponto, during the autumn of 1770, setting a libretto adapted from Racine and following the conventions of opera seria. The work required extensive arias in various emotional moods, recitatives that advanced the plot, ensemble pieces, and orchestral accompaniment that supported but did not overshadow the singers. Wolfgang completed the opera, attended rehearsals, made revisions based on the singer's requirements and preferences, and conducted the performances from the keyboard. The opera achieved success sufficient to generate additional commissions for subsequent seasons. Wolfgang composed Ascanio in Alba for a wedding celebration in Milan in 1771, and Lucio Silla for the 1772-73 season. These Italian commissions represented significant achievements for a teenager, but they did not lead to permanent employment or ongoing patronage. Wolfgang returned to Salzburg between the Italian journeys, resuming his duties as a court musician under a new archbishop, Hieronymus Colloredo, who had succeeded Schrattenbach in 1772. Colloredo maintained different expectations than his predecessor regarding court expenditures and regarding the privileges granted to court employees. He reduced spending on musical establishments, enforced stricter attendance requirements, and viewed the request for extended leaves of absence with less sympathy than Schrattenbach had shown. Wolfgang received an official appointment as Concertmeister in the Salzburg Court Chapel in 1772, a position that carried a modest salary and specific duties. He was expected to compose church music as required, to perform as a violinist in court concerts, and to fulfill whatever other musical responsibilities the archbishop deemed necessary. The position provided stability and regular income, but it also confined Wolfgang to Salzburg and to duties he found increasingly tedious. He composed masses, litanies, vesper settings, and other church music according to the requirements of the Catholic liturgical calendar. He wrote instrumental music for court concerts, including symphonies, serenades, and chamber works. He fulfilled his duties with competence, but the work offered limited opportunities for creative development or for establishing a reputation beyond Salzburg. The daily routine in Salzburg followed regular patterns. Wolfgang rose early, worked on composition, fulfilled his duties at court, and spent evenings in social activities or in private music-making. The Mozart household maintained connections with other musical families in Salzburg, and informal concerts occurred regularly in various homes. Wolfgang played billiards, attended the theater when traveling companies visited the city, and participated in the social life available to a young musician of his class. He corresponded with friends from the Italian journeys and maintained connections with musicians in other cities, but his actual residence in Salzburg limited his exposure to new developments and new opportunities. Leopold continued to plan journeys aimed at securing a better position for Wolfgang. In 1777, Wolfgang traveled to Munich, Augsburg, Mannheim, and Paris, initially accompanied by his mother rather than by Leopold, who could not obtain leave from his own court position. The journey aimed to secure employment at one of these courts, preferably in Mannheim or Paris, where the musical establishments were larger and more prestigious than Salzburg's. Wolfgang spent several months in Mannheim, hoping for appointment to the court orchestra, which was renowned for its discipline and technical excellence. He composed flute concertos and other works for potential patrons, gave concerts, and established connections with the court musicians, but the elector did not offer him a position. Wolfgang continued to Paris in the spring of 1778, still accompanied by his mother. Paris offered opportunities for composers willing to work within the French musical system, which emphasized opera in French, keyboard music for aristocratic amateurs, and occasional works for public concerts. Wolfgang composed symphonies, published keyboard sonatas, and sought commissions for theatrical works. He encountered Baron Grimm again, who assisted him in making connections, but who also observed that Wolfgang's approach to career advancement lacked the social polish and strategic deference that success in Paris required. Wolfgang's mother fell ill during the Paris stay and died in July 1778, a loss that affected Wolfgang deeply and that created additional tensions with Leopold, who blamed Wolfgang's inadequate attention to practical matters for the tragic outcome. Wolfgang returned to Salzburg in early 1779, resuming his position in the court chapel without having secured the alternative employment that had justified the expensive and ultimately devastating journey to Paris. Archbishop Colloredo appointed him as court organist, a position that carried increased responsibility and a modest increase in salary. Wolfgang continued to compose church music, to write instrumental works for court occasions, and to fulfill the various duties expected of a court musician. He worked with increasing facility in multiple compositional genres, producing works that demonstrated technical competence and musical inventiveness within established conventions. His masses showed mastery of counterpoint and vocal writing. His symphonies displayed sophistication in orchestration and formal structure. His chamber music balanced technical demands with elegant melodic writing. The routine of court employment involved regular hours, specific duties, and limited creative freedom. Wolfgang composed what was required, performed when directed, and managed the social relationships necessary to maintain his position. He attended Mass, participated in feast day celebrations, and fulfilled the ceremonial functions expected of a court musician. The work provided security, but offered little satisfaction. Wolfgang's letters from this period express frustration with Salzburg's provincialism, with the limitations of the court musical establishment, and with Colorado's emphasis on economy and efficiency over artistic ambition. The archbishop viewed musicians as employees providing a service, not as artists deserving special consideration. Wolfgang viewed himself increasingly as a composer whose talents exceeded the requirements of his position. In 1780, Wolfgang received a commission to compose an opera seria for Munich to be performed during the carnival season of 1781. He traveled to Munich in November 1780 to work on Idomeneo, Re di Creta, collaborating with the librettist on revisions, working with the singers on their arias, and rehearsing with the orchestra. The composition process involved extensive consultation with all participants, with Wolfgang making adjustments to accommodate vocal ranges, dramatic requirements, and orchestral capabilities. He supervised rehearsals, resolved musical and dramatic problems, and conducted the performances. Idomeneo represented Wolfgang's most ambitious operatic work to that date, incorporating extensive choruses, elaborate orchestral writing, and dramatic structures that moved beyond the conventional patterns of opera seria toward more integrated and dramatically coherent forms. The Munich performances succeeded with the court audience, but did not lead to permanent employment there. Wolfgang was summoned to Vienna in March 1781, where Archbishop Colloredo had traveled for a visit to the imperial capital. Wolfgang was expected to perform in the archbishop's retinue, to provide musical entertainment for the archbishop's hosts, and to fulfill whatever duties Colloredo assigned. The situation placed Wolfgang in an ambiguous position, housed with the archbishop's servants, required to wait for assignments, and prevented from accepting invitations to perform independently in Viennese aristocratic circles. The restrictions and the treatment ranked Wolfgang, who began to express open dissatisfaction with his position in Salzburg and with the archbishop's expectations. The tensions with Archbishop Colloredo reached a breaking point in May 1781. Wolfgang had requested permission to give a concert in Vienna for his own benefit, a common practice among court musicians when visiting major cities. Colloredo refused, viewing Wolfgang's request as insubordinate and his attitude as ungrateful. An exchange occurred between Wolfgang and Count Arco, the archbishop's chamberlain, which resulted in Wolfgang's formal dismissal from the Salzburg court chapel. The circumstances of the dismissal involved accusations from both sides, with Wolfgang claiming he had been insulted and physically abused, and Colloredo's officials claiming Wolfgang had been insolent and disobedient. The practical result was that Wolfgang found himself unemployed in Vienna, without a patron, without a court position, and without his father's approval for having abandoned the security of Salzburg employment. Leopold had counseled caution and had urged Wolfgang to maintain his position in Salzburg while seeking alternative employment through proper channels. Wolfgang's decision to break with Colloredo and to establish himself as an independent musician in Vienna contradicted Leopold's advice and created a breach between father and son that never fully healed. Leopold remained in Salzburg, maintaining his own position and supporting Nannerl, who continued to live at home and to work as a music teacher. Wolfgang established himself in Vienna as a freelance composer, performer, and teacher, without the institutional security that court employment provided, but with the freedom to pursue opportunities as they arose. Vienna in the early 1780s offered possibilities for musicians willing to navigate the complex social and economic structures of the imperial capital. The court employed an extensive musical establishment for church services, opera, and court concerts, but positions in this establishment opened rarely and were filled through patronage networks that Wolfgang did not yet command. The aristocracy maintained a lively musical culture, commissioning works from composers, organizing private concerts, and supporting musicians who gained their favor. Public concerts occurred regularly, organized by various associations and individual entrepreneurs. The city supported several theaters, including the court opera houses and smaller commercial theaters. A market existed for published music, particularly keyboard sonatas, chamber works, and arrangements of popular opera arias. Teaching provided steady income for musicians who could attract students from aristocratic or wealthy middle-class families. Wolfgang pursued all these possibilities simultaneously. He gave subscription concerts, organizing performances in rented halls or in private homes and selling tickets in advance to cover costs. He composed piano concertos for these concerts, performing them himself and featuring virtuosic solo parts that demonstrated his keyboard abilities. He accepted commissions for chamber music, composing string quartets, piano trios, and other works for aristocratic patrons. He taught keyboard to students, maintaining a schedule that involved traveling to various homes throughout the city. He composed operas, seeking librettos and opportunities to have works performed at the court theaters or at commercial venues. He published keyboard sonatas and other works, negotiating with publishers and managing the business aspects of these transactions himself. The financial model for this freelance career was inherently unstable. Income fluctuated with the seasons, with the aristocracy leaving Vienna for their country estates during the summer months, and with the theater season pausing during Lent. Concert income depended on successfully attracting subscribers and managing expenses. Teaching income varied with student retention and with the ability to maintain a full schedule. Publication income involved advance payments that rarely matched the composer's expectations. Wolfgang managed this financial uncertainty with mixed success, earning substantial sums during favorable periods but accumulating debts during slower times. He borrowed from friends, delayed payments to landlords, and repeatedly assured Leopold that his financial situation would stabilize once specific opportunities materialized. In the summer of 1782, Wolfgang married Constanze Weber, the younger sister of Aloysia Weber, with whom Wolfgang had fallen in love during his 1777-78 journey to Mannheim and Paris. Constanze came from a musical family with limited financial resources. Her father had died, and her mother managed the family with difficulty. Leopold opposed the marriage, viewing Constanze as an inappropriate choice who would burden Wolfgang with additional financial responsibilities and who came from a family Leopold considered manipulative and opportunistic. Wolfgang proceeded with the marriage despite Leopold's objections, further straining the relationship with his father. The marriage brought companionship and eventually 6 children, of whom only 2 survived infancy, but it also added domestic expenses to Wolfgang's financial obligations and complicated his ability to travel for professional opportunities. During the early years of his Vienna residence, Wolfgang achieved substantial recognition within the city's musical circles. His subscription concerts attracted audiences, and his performances of his own piano concertos established him as among the finest keyboard virtuosos in the city. He composed a series of piano concertos during 1784 and 1785 that represented some of his most sophisticated instrumental writing, balancing virtuosic solo passages with integrated orchestral participation and exploring harmonic and formal possibilities beyond conventional concerto structures. He performed these works himself, improvising cadenzas and demonstrating technical facility that impressed professional musicians and aristocratic amateurs alike. Wolfgang composed 6 string quartets dedicated to Joseph Haydn, a composer he admired and who had established the string quartet as a significant genre during the previous decades. Wolfgang worked on these quartets intermittently over a 3-year period, revising and refining them with unusual care. The quartets demonstrated sophisticated contrapuntal writing, innovative harmonic progressions, and integrated 4-part conversations among the instruments. Haydn, hearing Wolfgang perform several of these quartets at a private gathering, told Leopold that Wolfgang was the greatest composer he knew, a statement Leopold reported with satisfaction and that Wolfgang valued as recognition from a composer whose work he respected. Wolfgang gained opportunities to compose for the theatre, beginning with Die Entführung aus dem Serail, a Singspiel commissioned by the Court Theatre and performed in 1782. The work combined spoken dialogue with musical numbers, following the conventions of German-language comic opera, while incorporating more elaborate musical writing than typical Singspiel practice. The opera succeeded with Viennese audiences and received performances in other German cities, providing Wolfgang with his first operatic success since the Italian opere serie of his youth. The work demonstrated Wolfgang's ability to write effective theatrical music within German-language traditions, setting texts in ways that served dramatic situations and that displayed the capabilities of the singers without overwhelming the dramatic action. Wolfgang received an appointment as chamber composer to Emperor Joseph II in 1787, following the death of Christoph Willibald Gluck. The position carried a modest annual salary and minimal duties, primarily requiring Wolfgang to compose dances for court balls. The appointment provided some institutional connection and regular income, though the salary was significantly less than what Gluck had received, and the duties offered limited opportunities for substantial composition. Wolfgang accepted the position as a foothold in the imperial establishment, hoping it might lead to more significant appointments in the future. During this period, Wolfgang developed a collaborative relationship with Lorenzo da Ponte, a poet serving as official librettist to the court opera. Da Ponte provided librettos for 3 operas that represented Wolfgang's most significant theatrical achievements. Le Nozze di Figaro, premiered in Vienna in 1786, adapted Beaumarchais' controversial comedy, removing the play's most politically provocative elements while retaining its exploration of class tensions and romantic complications. Wolfgang set da Ponte's libretto with rapid-paced ensembles, arias that revealed character through musical characterization, and extended finales that integrated multiple dramatic threads. The Viennese premiere achieved modest success, but the work received enthusiastic response when performed in Prague later that year, leading to a commission for another opera from the Prague Theatre Management. Wolfgang composed Don Giovanni for Prague, setting da Ponte's reworking of the Don Juan legend with music that combined comic and serious elements in ways that challenged conventional operatic categories. The work premiered in Prague in October 1787 to favorable response, though Viennese audiences found the combination of dramatic styles less immediately appealing when the work was performed there in 1788. Wolfgang completed a 3rd collaboration with da Ponte, Così fan tutte, in 1790, exploring themes of fidelity and human nature through an artificial plot structure that da Ponte developed as a vehicle for Wolfgang's musical characterizations and ensemble writing. These operatic works demonstrated Wolfgang's ability to compose theatrical music that served dramatic purposes while maintaining musical sophistication. He worked within established conventions of opera, buffa providing the required aria forms, ensemble structures, and dramatic pacing, while finding ways to individualize characters through musical means, to integrate musical numbers into dramatic continuity, and to explore emotional complexity within comic frameworks. The operas succeeded with some audiences but did not achieve the widespread popularity or financial returns that might have stabilized Wolfgang's economic situation or secured his position in Vienna's competitive musical environment. Wolfgang's financial situation in Vienna deteriorated during the late 1780s. The subscription concert system that had provided substantial income during his first years in Vienna yielded diminishing returns. Aristocratic patrons maintained their support for specific events, but the regular series of concerts that Wolfgang had organized during 1784 and 1785 became increasingly difficult to sustain. Audiences had multiple entertainment options, and the novelty of Wolfgang's performances declined as other pianists established themselves in Vienna. Wolfgang's income from performances decreased while his expenses increased with his growing family and with the standard of living he attempted to maintain. Teaching remained a source of income, but Wolfgang found the work tedious and the schedule burdensome. He traveled to students' homes throughout Vienna, spending hours in instruction that diverted time and energy from composition. The income from teaching was steady but limited, insufficient to support the household without additional sources of revenue. Wolfgang took on students from families of varying social standing, adjusting his fees according to their circumstances, but never building a teaching practice that could serve as a reliable financial foundation. Publication of Wolfgang's compositions provided some income, but involved negotiations with publishers who operated their businesses according to their own commercial interests. Wolfgang sold compositions outright to publishers for lump sums that represented immediate income, but that did not provide ongoing revenue as the works were reprinted and distributed. Publishers in Vienna, Leipzig, and other cities sometimes issued Wolfgang's works without his authorization, copying from manuscripts, circulating among performers, and profiting from his music without compensation to the composer. Wolfgang attempted to manage these transactions, to negotiate better terms, and to protect his interests. But the business practices of music publishing in the 18th century favored publishers over composers. Wolfgang borrowed money regularly during this period, taking loans from friends, from lodge brothers in the Masonic organization he had joined in 1784, and from acquaintances in Vienna's musical community. The loans were meant as temporary measures to be repaid when anticipated income materialized or, when expected, opportunities produced payment. Wolfgang's letters to Michael Puchberg, a fellow mason and successful merchant, documented repeated requests for loans, expressions of optimism about forthcoming payments, and assurances that repayment would occur soon. Puchberg provided modest sums in response to many of these requests, though not always the full amounts Wolfgang sought, and he did not press for repayment with urgency. The relationship illustrated both Wolfgang's growing financial desperation and his inability to establish stable economic foundations for his career. Constanze's health created additional pressures. She experienced complications from pregnancies, miscarriages, and the illnesses of children, several of whom died in infancy. She required medical treatment that involved expenses for doctors, for medications, and for stays at spa towns where she sought relief from chronic conditions. Wolfgang arranged these treatments, borrowed to pay for them, and managed household affairs during Constanze's absences. The domestic situation added emotional strain to the financial pressures Wolfgang already faced. Leopold Mozart died in Salzburg in May 1787. Wolfgang did not travel to Salzburg for the funeral, citing professional commitments in Vienna that he could not abandon. The relationship between father and son had remained strained since Wolfgang's decision to leave Salzburg and to marry Constanze against Leopold's wishes. They had corresponded regularly, but had not achieved reconciliation. Leopold's death removed a significant figure from Wolfgang's life, someone who had directed Wolfgang's early career, had invested in his development, and had maintained expectations about Wolfgang's obligations to family and to prudent career management. Wolfgang's response to his father's death appears in letters that acknowledged the loss, but that focused primarily on practical matters regarding Leopold's estate and on Wolfgang's own continuing professional concerns. Wolfgang composed a series of symphonies in the summer of 1788, including the three final symphonies that later became recognized as significant achievements in the genre. He produced these works rapidly, completing them during a few weeks of intensive composition. The symphonies were not commissioned and did not have scheduled performances for which Wolfgang composed them. He may have planned to use them for concerts that never materialized, or he may have composed them as part of an effort to develop works for publication or for future use. The circumstances of their composition reflected Wolfgang's approach to managing his career through speculative creation of works that might later find performance opportunities or commercial outlets. Emperor Joseph II died in 1790, and Leopold II succeeded to the throne. Wolfgang's position as chamber composer continued under the new emperor, but Leopold II did not share Joseph II's interest in German-language opera or in Wolfgang's particular compositional approach. The change in imperial administration affected the cultural atmosphere in Vienna and reduced some of the opportunities Wolfgang had cultivated during Joseph II's reign. Wolfgang traveled to Frankfurt in 1790 for Leopold II's coronation, hoping to perform at concerts associated with the festivities and to attract the attention of aristocrats gathered for the occasion. The journey involved expenses that Wolfgang could ill afford, and the results did not justify the investment. He performed at a concert that was poorly attended, and he did not secure the recognition or opportunities he had anticipated. Wolfgang composed Die Zauberflöte in 1791, setting a libretto by Emanuel Schikaneder, a theater manager and performer who operated a commercial theater in the Viennese suburbs. The work combined elements of Singspiel tradition with Masonic symbolism, incorporating both comic scenes and serious moral themes. Schikaneder designed the production as popular entertainment, and Wolfgang adapted his compositional approach to suit the theater's resources and audience expectations. The opera premiered in September 1791 and achieved substantial success with Viennese audiences, running for many performances and generating income for Schikaneder's theater, though Wolfgang's payment for the work appears to have been modest relative to its commercial success. Wolfgang received a commission in the summer of 1791 to compose a requiem mass. The commission came through an intermediary, and the identity of the patron remained anonymous. Wolfgang began work on the requiem while completing Die Zauberflöte and while composing La Clemenza di Tito, an opera seria commissioned for Leopold II's coronation as King of Bohemia in Prague. Wolfgang traveled to Prague for the opera's premiere, which received a cool response from the coronation audience. He returned to Vienna in mid-September and continued work on the requiem, but his health began to deteriorate. He experienced fevers, swelling, and increasing weakness. Constanze and family friends arranged medical care, but Wolfgang's condition worsened through October and November. Wolfgang's final months involved continued work despite his declining health. He attended performances of Die Zauberflöte when his condition permitted, taking satisfaction in the opera's success with audiences. He worked on the requiem, composing sections and sketching others according to his established compositional methods. He maintained correspondence related to professional matters, attempting to manage the various commitments and opportunities he had cultivated throughout the year. His financial situation remained precarious, and he continued to seek loans, and to reassure creditors about forthcoming payments. The illness that affected Wolfgang during the autumn of 1791 produced symptoms that medical observers at the time could not conclusively diagnose. He experienced fever, swelling of his limbs, and pain that made sustained work increasingly difficult. He consulted with doctors who prescribed treatments according to the medical understanding of the period, which involved bloodletting, purges, and other interventions meant to restore bodily balance. The treatments did not arrest the progression of the illness, and Wolfgang's condition continued to deteriorate. Wolfgang remained in his apartment in central Vienna, attended by Constanze, by their household servants, and by friends who visited. He discussed the Requiem with Franz Süssmayr, a student and assistant who had been helping him with various compositional tasks. Wolfgang explained his intentions for the unfinished sections of the work, providing guidance about how it should be completed. He maintained his interest in musical affairs, in his family's welfare, and in the practical matters that required attention even as his physical capacity diminished. In late November 1791, Wolfgang's condition worsened significantly. He became bedridden, unable to work or to participate in household activities. Constanze arranged for constant attendance, and medical practitioners continued their treatments, but Wolfgang's condition did not improve. He experienced periods of clarity and periods of delirium. He spoke about music, about his family, and about various professional matters that concerned him. The illness progressed through the first week of December. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died shortly before 1 a.m. on December 5, 1791. He was 35 years old. Constanze was present, as were some friends and household members. The immediate cause of death was recorded as severe miliary fever, a diagnosis that corresponded to observable symptoms but that did not identify an underlying condition with precision. Modern medical analysis of the historical evidence has proposed various possible causes, including streptococcal infection, rheumatic fever, kidney disease, or other conditions that could produce the symptoms Wolfgang experienced. The actual cause remains uncertain, as medical knowledge in 1791 could not provide the diagnostic precision that later developments would make possible. The funeral arrangements followed standard practices for a person of Wolfgang's social and economic standing in Vienna. The body was blessed in a small chapel ceremony at St. Stephen's Cathedral. The casket was then transported to the St. Mark's Cemetery outside the city walls, where Wolfgang was buried in a common grave, the standard practice for persons who were not aristocrats and who did not purchase private burial plots. Several friends and musicians attended the chapel ceremony, but weather conditions and the distance to the cemetery meant that few, if any, mourners accompanied the body to its burial. No permanent marker indicated the grave's location, and no monument commemorated the site. Constanze faced immediate practical problems following Wolfgang's death. The household carried debts that required settlement. Wolfgang's possessions, including manuscripts, musical instruments, and personal items, needed to be inventoried and evaluated. Constanze petitioned Emperor Leopold II for financial assistance, citing Wolfgang's service as chamber composer and her situation as a widow with young children. The petition received a sympathetic response, and Constanze was granted a modest pension from the court. She organized benefit concerts featuring Wolfgang's music to generate additional income. She arranged for Süssmayr to complete the Requiem so that it could be delivered to the anonymous patron who had commissioned it, and she worked to protect her interests in Wolfgang's unpublished compositions. The immediate response to Wolfgang's death in Vienna's musical community involved expressions of regret and recognition of his contributions, but without the sustained mourning or elaborate tributes that might have accompanied the death of a more prominent court figure. Obituaries appeared in newspapers and musical journals, noting Wolfgang's achievements as a composer and performer. Musicians who had known him shared memories and assessments of his work. Plans developed for benefit concerts for Constanze and the children, involving performances of Wolfgang's music organized by colleagues and supporters. The months following Wolfgang's death saw the gradual dispersal of his personal effects, the settlement of debts, and Constanze's efforts to establish financial stability for herself and her children. She sold manuscripts to publishers, arranged for publication of works that Wolfgang had completed but not yet issued, and managed the household economy with assistance from friends and advisers. She eventually remarried, choosing Georg Nikolaus Nissen, a Danish diplomat who became interested in documenting Wolfgang's life and career. Together they gathered materials for a biography, collecting letters, documenting compositions, and interviewing people who had known Wolfgang. Wolfgang's music continued to be performed in Vienna and in other European cities during the years immediately following his death. Die Zauberflöte maintained its popularity in Viennese theaters, performing regularly and demonstrating commercial viability. Don Giovanni received performances in various opera houses, gaining recognition as a significant work within the opera buffa repertoire. The piano concertos circulated among performers, particularly those that Wolfgang had published or that existed in multiple manuscript copies. Some chamber works found regular use among amateur musicians, particularly string quartets and piano trios that balanced technical challenge with accessible musical content. Publishers issued some of Wolfgang's works posthumously, recognizing commercial potential in music by a composer whose recent death generated renewed interest. The publications varied in accuracy and completeness as publishers worked from manuscripts of uncertain provenance and often made alterations to suit their assessment of market preferences. Constanze attempted to manage this publication process, working with publishers she considered reliable and trying to protect her financial interests in Wolfgang's musical legacy. The emergence of a more substantial appreciation of Wolfgang's musical achievement developed gradually over several decades following his death. During the early 19th century, as musical aesthetics shifted toward romantic ideals emphasizing individual genius, emotional expression, and transcendent artistic vision, Wolfgang's music found advocates who positioned his works as exemplifying these values. Writers and critics began to construct narratives about Wolfgang's life that emphasized his natural gifts, his struggles against limited recognition, and his premature death as tragic loss. These narratives selected aspects of Wolfgang's actual biography, but shaped them according to developing romantic conceptions about artistic genius and society's relationship to exceptional creative figures. Performances of Wolfgang's operas increased during the early decades of the 19th century, particularly in German-speaking theaters that promoted them as foundational works in the development of German opera. Die Zauberflöte achieved particular prominence in this context, interpreted as combining accessible entertainment with deeper philosophical and moral significance. Don Giovanni gained reputation as a dramatically powerful work that transcended conventional comic opera structures. The late symphonies began to receive recognition as sophisticated achievements in orchestral writing, comparable to the symphonies of Haydn and to those of Beethoven, who acknowledged Wolfgang's influence on his own symphonic development. Scholars and musicians in the 19th century began systematic efforts to collect Wolfgang's compositions, to establish accurate texts, and to publish complete editions. These efforts revealed the breadth of Wolfgang's compositional output, encompassing not only the operas and orchestral works that had gained some currency, but also extensive church music, chamber works, piano sonatas, concert arias, and compositions in numerous other genres. The sheer quantity of music Wolfgang had produced during his relatively short life became part of the developing mythology around his achievement, serving as evidence of extraordinary productivity and facility. The 19th century also saw the emergence of biographical traditions about Wolfgang that selected and interpreted events from his life to support particular conceptions about artistic genius. The story of Wolfgang as child prodigy, traveling across Europe and amazing aristocratic audiences, became a standard element in these narratives. His conflicts with Archbishop Colloredo were interpreted as struggles between artistic freedom and institutional constraint. His financial difficulties in Vienna were portrayed as evidence of society's failure to recognize and adequately support exceptional talent. His death, at age 35, was framed as tragedy, cutting short a career that might have produced even greater works had Wolfgang lived longer. These biographical narratives, while based on actual events, shaped those events according to the values and assumptions of 19th-century Romantic culture. They emphasized Wolfgang's individuality, his rejection of conventional limitations, and his dedication to artistic ideals above practical considerations. This interpretation served specific cultural purposes in the 19th century, providing a model of the artist as autonomous creative figure, but it also obscured aspects of Wolfgang's actual career that did not fit this template. Wolfgang had spent much of his career seeking court appointments, working within established patronage systems, and adapting his compositional approach to the requirements of specific institutions and audiences. He had composed music for various purposes, including church services, court ceremonies, public entertainments, and private performances, not always distinguishing sharply between commercial work and artistic expression. The establishment of Wolfgang's reputation as one of the central figures in European musical history occurred through multiple processes extending over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Music conservatories incorporated his works into standard pedagogical curricula, with piano students learning his sonatas and concertos, singers studying his opera arias, and composition students analyzing his treatment of form, harmony, and counterpoint. Opera companies maintained his major operas in regular repertoire, with productions adapting works originally staged in 18th-century conditions to 19th-century theatrical conventions and tastes. Publishers issued scholarly editions attempting to present Wolfgang's music as he had written it, removing alterations accumulated through decades of performance practice and editorial interpretation. The 20th century saw continued scholarly investigation into Wolfgang's compositional methods, biographical circumstances, and historical context. Researchers examined manuscripts, letters, and documentary evidence to establish more accurate understanding of Wolfgang's career development, creative processes, and relationships with the institutions and individuals who had shaped his opportunities. This scholarly work sometimes challenged romanticized narratives that had developed during the 19th century, revealing a more complex picture of Wolfgang as a working composer navigating the practical realities of 18th-century musical life. Wolfgang's music remained central to performance repertoire throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, with his operas, symphonies, concertos, and chamber works performed regularly by professional ensembles and studied by musicians in training. Recording technology made Wolfgang's music widely available, allowing listeners access to performances of works that might rarely be presented in live concert settings. Different performers and conductors developed varying interpretive approaches to Wolfgang's music, some emphasizing dramatic intensity and emotional expression, others focusing on structural clarity and adherence to 18th-century performance practices as understood through historical research. The assessment of Wolfgang's musical achievement has continued to evolve as musical scholarship has refined understanding of 18th century compositional practices, performance conventions, and cultural contexts. Wolfgang's music has been recognized as representing sophisticated work within the stylistic and generic frameworks of his time, demonstrating mastery of the compositional techniques valued in that period, while also exploring possibilities within and occasionally beyond conventional approaches. His operas have been acknowledged as addressing dramatic challenges through musical means in ways that influenced subsequent opera composers. His instrumental music has been studied for its treatment of form, its harmonic language, and its integration of technical virtuosity with musical expression. The biographical interest in Wolfgang has persisted alongside the musical appreciation, with continued fascination about his life circumstances, his relationships with family members and colleagues, and the conditions under which he produced his extensive compositional output. Popular culture has generated films, novels, and plays based on Wolfgang's life, often emphasizing dramatic elements and interpreting his experiences according to contemporary values and assumptions. These popular representations have sometimes reinforced older mythologies, even as scholarly understanding has developed more nuanced perspectives. The musical works themselves, separated from biographical narratives and interpretive frameworks, continue to exist as complex objects available for performance, analysis, and listening. They can be approached from multiple perspectives, examined as products of specific historical circumstances, as examples of compositional craft within established traditions, as expressions of particular aesthetic values, or as structures of organized sound that continue to engage listeners regardless of knowledge about their origins or the life of their composer. The meanings attributed to Wolfgang's music have varied across different historical periods, cultural contexts, and individual listeners, shaped by changing aesthetic preferences, evolving performance practices, and different frameworks for understanding musical significance. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's music remains part of standard repertoire more than 2 centuries after his death, performed regularly, studied extensively, and valued for various qualities that different listeners, performers, and scholars have identified. The historical process through which this music and its composer have been remembered, interpreted, and positioned within broader narratives about European cultural achievement has involved multiple factors extending well beyond the music itself, including institutional developments in musical performance and education, changing aesthetic values, scholarly research, and the various ways that different periods have constructed relationships with their cultural past. The actual sound of Wolfgang's music, the experiences of those who perform it, and the responses of those who listen continue independently of these historical processes, existing as immediate phenomena available for direct engagement without necessary reference to accumulated interpretations or established positions within cultural hierarchies.